In the year 410 AD, something happened that the ancient world had genuinely believed was impossible. Rome fell. Not the provinces, not some distant frontier fort, the city itself. The beating heart of a civilization that had stood essentially unconquered for 800 years was breached. Visigoth warriors poured through the Salarian Gate, and for 3 days, the eternal city burned. Crack open almost any standard history textbook, and you'll get a fairly tidy explanation for how this happened. Mad emperors, political corruption eating away at the institutions from within, endless waves of barbarian tribes finally overwhelming an overstretched military. It's the story most of us learned in school. Rome collapsed because its people got soft, its leaders got greedy, and its enemies got tired of waiting outside the gates. That story isn't wrong, exactly, but it's dangerously incomplete. Because in the last 2 decades, an entirely different group of investigators has been quietly rewriting this story. Not historians poring over dusty scrolls, but climatologists drilling into ancient ice sheets, and geneticists extracting DNA from 2,000-year-old mass graves. And what they've found suggests that Rome wasn't simply murdered by men holding swords. It was slowly, systematically dismantled by an enemy far more patient, far more invisible, and far more impossible to negotiate with than any barbarian king. A hostile, shifting climate, and a series of pandemics that make anything most of us have lived through look almost mild by comparison. Today, we're stripping away the textbook version of this story to look at the actual assassins hiding underneath it. The climate shock nobody saw coming, the microscopic killers that rode along Rome's own trade routes, and the volcanic catastrophe that plunged the ancient world into darkness at the worst possible moment. If you like your history with the myths stripped away, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story Chronosphere Academy was built to tell. Let's start at the top, at the very height of Roman power, because you can't understand how something this massive collapsed without first understanding exactly what it was standing on. To understand how Rome eventually died, you first have to understand something most people never think to ask about how it managed to thrive in the first place. At its territorial peak, somewhere around the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from the damp, rain-soaked hills of Scotland all the way to the scorching desert edges of Egypt and North Africa. It's estimated the empire contained something close to 1/4 of the entire world's population at the time, all held together under a single administrative and military system. It built aqueducts that still stand today. It built domes of poured concrete that modern engineers are still studying to understand exactly how the Romans achieved that level of structural durability. It built a trade network so vast and so interconnected that historians argue nothing comparable existed again for close to 1,000 years afterward. It's tempting to credit all of this purely to Roman engineering, brilliance, and military discipline, and those things certainly mattered enormously. But there was a second, largely invisible partner in Rome's rise that rarely gets mentioned in the traditional telling of this story: the weather itself. Climate scientists studying this period now refer to it as the Roman climate optimum, an unusually long stretch, lasting roughly from around 200 BC to 150 AD, during which the Mediterranean region experienced remarkably stable, warm, and consistently humid conditions. This wasn't simply pleasant weather. It was, functionally, the ideal agricultural environment for exactly the kind of empire Rome was trying to build. The volcanic soils blanketing much of Italy, combined with the sprawling grain-producing plains of Roman North Africa, particularly in what is now Tunisia and Egypt, produced massive, dependable surpluses of grain year after year. And because the climate remained so consistently favorable for such a long stretch of time, Rome was able to build something genuinely unprecedented for the ancient world: a fully interconnected, quasi-globalized economy where reliability of supply could actually be counted on across enormous distances. Grain grown along the Nile fed the crowded tenements of the city of Rome, over 1,000 miles away. Olive oil pressed in southern Spain lit lamps for soldiers stationed on the cold, distant frontier of Roman Britain. Wine from Gaul, pottery from Italy, textiles from Egypt. All of it moved along an integrated system of roads and shipping lanes that depended, at every single link in the chain, on predictable harvests arriving on schedule, year after year, decade after decade. The Romans, understandably, came to believe they had simply been blessed. Their poets and historians wrote about the empire as something eternal, a permanent fixture of the world that would naturally persist because Rome itself had somehow earned that permanence through virtue, strength, and divine favor. They had, in reality, built an extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily complex machine, one that functioned brilliantly under a very specific, narrow set of environmental conditions. And like any complex machine built around a narrow tolerance, it carried a hidden vulnerability nobody had bothered to plan for. What happens if the conditions that made it possible simply stop holding steady? Around the year 150 AD, they got their answer. The climate that had quietly underwritten Rome's entire golden age began, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to turn against them. The shift away from the Roman climate optimum didn't arrive as a single dramatic event that anyone at the time could point to and immediately recognize as a turning point. It unfolded gradually, over decades, the kind of slow-motion transition that's almost impossible to perceive while you're living through it, and only becomes obvious centuries later, once scientists have the tools to measure it precisely. Ice core samples extracted from deep within the Greenland ice sheet, along with stalagmite formations pulled from caves across Europe, allow modern researchers to reconstruct historical temperature and precipitation patterns with startling precision, essentially reading centuries-old climate data the way you might read growth rings in an ancient tree. And what these records show, layer by layer, is that the reliable warmth and stability of the Roman optimum began breaking down right around the middle of the 2nd century, giving way to a considerably more chaotic and unpredictable climate pattern. Droughts stretched on for multiple consecutive years in regions that had previously supported dependable harvests. Winters, in certain stretches, turned brutally, unusually cold. The predictable rhythm that Roman agriculture had been built entirely around for generations began to sputter and stall. Crop yields fell. Grain reserves that cities like Rome depended on to feed enormous urban populations began running dangerously thin in years when the harvest simply didn't arrive on schedule or at the volume the system required. But as devastating as hunger and food scarcity were on their own, they turned out to be only the opening act of what was about to unfold. Because when climate patterns shift, they don't just threaten crops. They quietly redraw an entirely different kind of border, the borders of disease. In the year 165 AD, Roman legions returning from a military campaign in the eastern provinces carried something back with them that would prove far deadlier than any enemy they'd faced on the battlefield. It began circulating within military camps, and then, catastrophically, began spreading outward along the very network of roads and trade routes that had made the Roman world so remarkably interconnected in the first place. They called it the Antonine Plague. Modern researchers, working with genetic material recovered from period burial sites, believe it was most likely an early strain of smallpox, though the exact pathogen remains a subject of ongoing scientific debate. The symptoms, as documented by physicians of the era, were horrific by any standard. Victims suffered raging fevers, severe diarrhea, and disfiguring pustules erupting across the entire body. The renowned Roman physician Galen personally documented cases during the outbreak, describing patients coughing up scab-like material from throats that were, in effect, rotting from the inside as the disease progressed. The resulting death toll was staggering, even accounting for the natural uncertainty involved in estimating ancient population statistics. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 5 and 10 million people died across the empire, potentially close to a third of the entire Roman population at the time. Within the city of Rome alone, contemporary accounts describe as many as 2,000 deaths occurring in a single day during the outbreak's worst periods. The plague tore through the Roman military, decimating entire units and severely undermining the empire's ability to defend its increasingly pressured frontiers. It wiped out enormous numbers of tax-paying citizens, gutting the government's fiscal capacity at precisely the moment when military and administrative costs were climbing. It paralyzed commerce and agricultural labor simultaneously, compounding the economic damage already being inflicted by the shifting climate. The very interconnectedness that had once represented Rome's single greatest strength. The roads, the shipping lanes, the seamless movement of people and goods across thousands of miles, instantly transformed into its greatest vulnerability. The infrastructure built for prosperity became, almost overnight, an efficient highway system for mass death, And yet, remarkably, the empire survived this first catastrophic blow. It fractured in places. It bled resources and population it could scarcely afford to lose. But Rome adapted, as it had so many times before, militarizing its society further, raising taxes to compensate for lost revenue, and slowly clawing its way back from the edge of total collapse. Nature, unfortunately for Rome, wasn't finished with it yet. Not even close. Before we jump forward to the empire's final, catastrophic collision with climate and disease in the 6th century, it's worth understanding what happened in between, because the 3rd century ad delivered a preview of exactly how bad things could get when environmental pressure and pandemic disease arrived together. Barely a century after the Antonine Plague finished tearing through the empire, a second, equally devastating pandemic struck. Named the Cyprian Plague after the bishop who documented its horrifying progression in vivid, harrowing detail, this outbreak swept through the Roman world beginning around 249 AD. Bishop Cyprian described a disease that caused violent vomiting, bleeding from the eyes, and, in its most severe cases, gangrenous rot that could claim a victim's hands or feet while they were still alive to feel it happening. This second pandemic arrived at possibly the worst conceivable moment. Climate instability, building on the disruptions that had begun a century earlier, was intensifying pressure on populations well beyond Rome's own borders, including, crucially, the various Germanic and Gothic tribes living along and beyond the empire's northern frontiers. As their own agricultural conditions deteriorated and resources grew scarcer, these groups faced an increasingly urgent choice: stay put and starve, or push into Roman territory in search of land, food, and stability. The resulting period, which historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, saw the Roman Empire come remarkably close to complete disintegration nearly 200 years before its eventual traditional fall date in 476 AD. Provinces splintered off into breakaway states. A rapid, dizzying succession of emperors rose and fell, many of them murdered by their own soldiers within months of taking power, as the imperial treasury collapsed under the combined weight of plague-driven revenue loss, expensive military campaigns against increasingly desperate frontier tribes, and a currency crisis so severe that Roman coins were debased to a fraction of their original silver. Content: Rome, against fairly steep odds, pulled itself back together under a series of capable military emperors who managed to reunify the fractured territories and stabilize the currency and administration by the century's end. But the crisis left permanent scars, permanently reshaping how the empire was governed, defended, and financed for the remainder of its existence. It also offered a preview, in miniature, of the exact combination of forces: climate stress, pandemic disease, and resulting migration pressure along the frontiers. That would eventually deliver the empire's true final blow, roughly 3 centuries later. Fast forward now to the 6th century AD. The western half of the Roman Empire had already formally collapsed by this point. Its final emperor deposed in 476 AD, with various Germanic kingdoms now controlling the territories that had once answered to Rome. But the eastern half of the empire, what historians call the Byzantine Empire, ruled from the magnificent city of Constantinople, remained very much alive, wealthy, and increasingly ambitious. Under Emperor Justinian, Byzantine forces launched an extraordinarily ambitious military campaign aimed at nothing less than reconquering the lost Western territories and restoring the old Roman Empire to something resembling its former unified glory. For a period, remarkably, it actually seemed to be working. Byzantine armies retook North Africa. They pushed into Italy itself, capturing Rome. And then, in the year 536 AD, something happened in the sky that nobody at the time could adequately explain, and that would ultimately doom Justinian's entire dream before it ever had a real chance to succeed. A series of massive volcanic eruptions. The exact location remains debated among researchers, with leading candidates including Iceland and volcanic sites in the Americas. Blasted an almost unimaginable quantity of ash and sulfur aerosols directly into the upper atmosphere. The resulting atmospheric veil circled the entire globe, blocking out a significant portion of incoming sunlight for months, and in some regions, for well over a year. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing at the time, left behind a description that still reads as genuinely eerie 14 centuries later. The sun, he wrote, gave off its light without any brightness at all, resembling the moon rather than the sun, for the entirety of that year. Global temperatures, according to modern tree ring and ice core reconstructions, plummeted by as much as 3 degrees Celsius within the span of a single decade. An almost unthinkably rapid and severe shift by the standards of natural climate variation. Summer snowfalls, virtually unheard of across large stretches of the Mediterranean and continental Europe, devastated crops that farmers had no historical precedent to prepare for. This period has since become known among climate historians as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and reconstructed temperature records indicate it produced the single coldest decade recorded anywhere in the last 2,000 years. Famine swept across an enormous swath of the ancient world, from Europe through the Middle East and into parts of Asia. Contemporary accounts describe desperate populations reduced to eating weeds, pulled from fields, and stripping bark directly from trees in a frantic effort to survive. Entire regional economies, already strained by decades of slowly building climate instability, buckled almost entirely under the sudden, catastrophic shock. And in the wake of this mass starvation, with populations already severely weakened, malnourished, and displaced from their normal patterns of settlement and trade, came the single deadliest pandemic the ancient world had ever experienced, one that would finally, definitively end any realistic hope of restoring the old unified Roman Empire. This new pandemic wasn't smallpox, and it wasn't whatever pathogen had driven the earlier Cyprian outbreak. This was something modern genetic analysis has definitively identified as Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the medieval Black Death that would devastate Europe roughly 8 centuries later. Carried by infected fleas, riding on rats that traveled aboard Roman grain shipments originating in Egypt. The disease first struck the Byzantine capital of Constantinople in 541 AD. At the outbreak's absolute peak, contemporary sources describe an almost incomprehensible death toll, as many as 10,000 people dying within the capital city in a single day. The scale of mortality overwhelmed every normal mechanism the city had for handling its dead. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be properly buried, forcing officials to resort to packing corpses into the hollow towers built into the city's defensive walls, until the stench of decomposition reportedly hung over the entire capital, inescapable no matter where within the city walls you happened to be standing. This outbreak, now generally referred to as the Justinian Plague, ultimately spread far beyond Constantinople itself, rippling outward across the Mediterranean world and into parts of Europe and the Middle East over the following decades, in recurring waves that some historians argue continued intermittently for well over a century afterward. The financial and human cost to the Byzantine state was catastrophic on nearly every level. Tax revenue collapsed as vast numbers of tax-paying citizens died. Military recruitment became increasingly difficult as the available population of able-bodied men shrank dramatically. The elaborate, expensive military campaign to reclaim the old Western Roman territories, which had seemed genuinely achievable just years earlier, became financially and logistically impossible to sustain. Justinian's dream of a fully reunified Roman Empire didn't die on a battlefield, defeated by a rival army in open combat. It died in the plague-ravaged streets of his own capital city, buried, quite literally in some cases, under mountains of his own subjects' bodies. Before we step back to draw the larger lesson out of all of this, there's one more piece of evidence worth understanding, because it comes from an entirely unexpected source, and it reveals something remarkable about just how far Rome's economic reach actually extended, and just how precisely its collapse can now be measured. Buried deep within the Greenland ice sheet are microscopic traces of airborne pollution, deposited layer by layer, year after year, for thousands of years, exactly the way tree rings recur to forests' history. Beginning in the final centuries BC, researchers analyzing ice cores extracted from this ice sheet have identified a sharp, sustained rise in atmospheric lead pollution, a direct byproduct of the massive silver mining and smelting operations that fueled the Roman monetary system, particularly extensive mining operations located in what is now Spain. This lead pollution signal is so precise and so consistently tied to periods of known Roman economic activity that scientists have been able to use it almost like an economic barometer for the ancient world. When Roman mining operations were running at full capacity, funding coinage, military expansion, and imperial infrastructure, the corresponding lead signal in the Greenland ice grows correspondingly stronger. When those same operations slow down or stop entirely, the ice record shows it just as clearly, sometimes with startling precision down to individual decades. And what that ice reveals about the periods we've just walked through is genuinely striking. During the depths of the Antonine Plague and the following crisis of the 3rd century, atmospheric lead pollution recorded in the Greenland ice drops sharply, reflecting a mining and minting economy that had been severely disrupted by mass death, currency collapse, and administrative breakdown. It's a remarkable form of confirmation, arriving from a source that has absolutely nothing to do with written history. Polar ice, thousands of miles from Rome itself, quietly recording the economic heartbeat of an empire in crisis, one thin annual layer at a time. Following the eruptions of 536 AD and the Justinian plague that followed, the ice record shows an even more dramatic collapse. Roman and Byzantine mining output, once among the largest industrial operations the ancient world had ever produced, drops to levels barely detectable in the ice core record, and remarkably, doesn't meaningfully recover for centuries afterward. According to some researchers who've studied this data closely, atmospheric lead pollution from European mining wouldn't return to Roman-era levels again until sometime around the height of the medieval period, hundreds of years later. Think about the scale of what that actually represents. An industrial and economic capacity that took the Roman world centuries to build, reflected in a pollution signature powerful enough to register in ice sheets an ocean away, effectively vanished within a single generation, and took the better part of a millennium to reconstitute itself to anything resembling its former scale. That's not simply a political transition from one form of government to another. That's a civilization's entire productive capacity being knocked back by roughly 1,000 years, recorded in a medium far more objective, and in some ways far more chilling than any surviving Roman text could ever be. Step back now and look at the full arc of what actually brought the ancient Roman world to its knees, layer by layer, across roughly 4 centuries of accumulating pressure. The traditional story: corrupt emperors, military overreach, barbarian invasions breaching the frontier, isn't false. All of those things genuinely happened, and they genuinely mattered. But viewed in isolation, that version of events makes Rome's fall sound almost like a simple morality tale. A great civilization grew soft, grew greedy, and eventually got what was coming to it. The climate and pandemic evidence tells a considerably more sobering and arguably more universally relevant story. Rome didn't simply fail because its leaders were flawed, though plenty of them certainly were. Rome fell because it had constructed an extraordinarily sophisticated, extraordinarily interconnected civilization that depended, at nearly every critical juncture, on environmental conditions remaining stable enough to support it. The moment that underlying environmental stability began to falter, first gradually, through the slow breakdown of the Roman climate optimum, and then catastrophically, through a volcanic winter nobody could have predicted or prevented, the entire elaborate system built on top of that stability began to buckle. The very features that made Rome so remarkably successful, its vast trade networks, its densely interconnected cities, its efficient roads linking every corner of an enormous empire, became the exact same mechanisms that allowed catastrophe to spread with terrifying speed and thoroughness once it began. A plague that might have remained a localized, contained tragedy in a less connected world instead moved along Rome's own infrastructure with devastating efficiency, reaching virtually every corner of the empire within a matter of years. There's a genuinely humbling lesson embedded in all of this, one that applies well beyond the specific historical details of ancient Rome. Complexity and interconnection can be a civilization's greatest source of strength and prosperity right up until the moment they become its greatest source of fragility. A system optimized brilliantly for one set of stable conditions can prove remarkably vulnerable once those underlying conditions shift, no matter how advanced its engineering, how disciplined its military, or how sophisticated its administrative institutions happen to be. We tend to look back at the Romans primarily as a cautionary tale about internal moral failure, about corruption, decadence, and political dysfunction eating away at a once great society from within. That story isn't entirely wrong, and it's certainly more comfortable to tell, because it suggests that collapse is fundamentally a failure of character, something a sufficiently virtuous society could always avoid through better leadership and stronger values. The climate and pandemic evidence offers a less comfortable, but ultimately more honest lesson. No matter how advanced your engineering becomes, no matter how powerful your military or how efficiently globalized your economy grows, there remains a fundamental, non-negotiable layer beneath all of it. The actual physical environment your entire civilization depends on to keep functioning. And that layer answers to forces no empire, however powerful, has ever been able to fully control. Rome had the finest engineers, the most disciplined legions, and one of the most sophisticated administrative systems the ancient world had ever produced. None of it mattered once the climate itself, and the diseases that climate instability helped unleash, decided to have the final say. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with how uncomfortably relevant this pattern feels from the vantage point of the present. We live today inside a global civilization that is, by any measure, vastly more interconnected than anything Rome ever managed to build. Supply chains spanning continents, financial systems linked in real time, populations dependent on stable agricultural output from regions thousands of miles from where the food is actually consumed. We saw, within just the last several years, how quickly a single novel pathogen could ripple through that interconnected system, disrupting shipping routes, emptying store shelves, and revealing just how fragile even our most sophisticated logistics networks could become under sudden, unexpected strain. None of this is meant to suggest that modern civilization is doomed to repeat Rome's exact fate. We have tools the Romans never possessed. Genuine scientific understanding of how diseases spread, the capacity to develop vaccines within months rather than suffering through decades or centuries of blind trial and error, and at least the theoretical ability to anticipate certain kinds of environmental stress well before it arrives, rather than discovering it only in hindsight through ice cores drilled centuries later. But the underlying vulnerability Rome's story exposes, the way genuine interconnected complexity can quietly convert prosperity into fragility once conditions shift outside the narrow range a system was actually built to handle, hasn't gone away just because our technology has improved. If anything, our systems have grown so much more complex and so much more tightly linked across the globe that the potential for cascading failure, when it does eventually arrive, may prove even harder to contain than anything the Romans ever faced. Perhaps the most valuable thing the fall of Rome actually offers us isn't a warning about moral decay, corrupt leadership, or civilizational decline in the abstract. It's a very specific, very concrete reminder that resilience matters just as much as raw capability. A civilization that has built extraordinary strength but has invested nothing in flexibility, redundancy, or the capacity to absorb genuine shocks is a civilization that looks unstoppable right up until the exact moment it isn't. If this deep dive into the hidden forces behind history's most famous collapse changed the way you think about the fall of Rome, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed to Chronosphere Academy, because we go looking for exactly these kinds of overlooked forces in every episode. What historical mystery should we decode next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, remember, history is closer than you think.